Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to Glasgow Loves EU's lockdown live stream. And tonight we're really delighted to welcome Professor Juliet Lodge. Thanks ever so much for agreeing to talk to us this evening. My name's Fiona.
Lovely to be in Glasgow.
Yeah, it's good to be in Glasgow. Yeah, hopefully sometime soon you will be. My name's Fiona Wishlade, and also with us on the chat are Bernd Poor, who's checking that all the tech works for us, and Jenny Breslin, who's going to be monitoring social media and picking up any questions that that come in. So if you were watching last week, you'll know that we linked in with International Rare Diseases Day, and we spoke to Professor Faisal Ahmed, and tonight we're linking in with International Women's Day, and it's especially fitting that Juliet is our guest tonight. She's the first and only Brit to have been elected Woman of Europe, and she's also played a lead role in the campaign group Women for Europe. Juliet's also Professor Emerita at the University of Leeds and has written widely on various aspects of European integration, including the role of the European Parliament, data protection, security, and a range of other key issues. So there's so many things that we could ask you about. We might have to ask you to come back again. But let's start off with International Women's Day. And you launched a series of pieces in Sussex bylines this week, and we'll post a link, I think, on Facebook and social media for anyone who hasn't seen these. Can you tell us a bit about a bit about that sort of like series of pieces and what the aim was behind those?
Yes, the real aim behind it was to have a little celebration of International Women's Day.
So you're going to tell us about the Sussex byline piece, yeah.
I think the thing was that with all the bylines in the different regions, they all seem to be celebrating International Women's Day in one way or another. And in Sussex, there's things that are going on that are rather like in other parts of the country, where people are looking to have statues to celebrate suffragettes or women who've made a big contribution to public life. And Sussex is one of the newer bylines, and the general group thought that it would be nice to have something celebrating women, starting off with the international UN aim to have more women in leadership and more women role models for women and girls generally, right across the world.
And I mean, why, in 2021, why do we still need to have an International Women's Day, and how far have we got to go?
How far back do we go? I think the dreadful thing is that so much is rolling backwards that one feels that it's almost as bad as when I was young, in terms of the kind of sexism one encounters. And I think the biggest threat to women's rights in Europe for Britain is that we're out of Europe. That's a drastic loss. In terms of internationally, there's still less than 30% of leaders are women. Fewer than 30% across the world are women, and over 70% of women have borne the brunt across the world of the pandemic. And also the fact that women now are having to choose because of the unemployment and because of the way the pandemic's panned out, with women doing the bulk of the work at home or being in the most precarious jobs. We need to have ways of protecting those jobs and also protecting women. But there does seem to be evidence mounting that a lot of women are finding it necessary to give up their careers at a time when the UN would like to see more women leading in trade, more women leading in education or getting education, and more women in security even, in order that we might have a different type of input into the global agenda. Yeah.
Although it's good to see that we do have now a woman heading up the World Trade Organization, for example, which is a good news shift. Okay, well, I mean, staying with the theme for a moment, you formed the campaign group Women for Europe, and what's the aim of this group, and why specifically, you know, a group for women in Europe?
Women in Europe, I think when it first began, Susie Coldwood, who's based in Sussex, really had this idea that women networked quite effectively, but women were very time poor. And therefore there had to be some kind of way in which women would be able to get together, campaign, not be tied down to some very hierarchical organisation, and not just be in the role of being the handmaidens, in effect, making the tea. It sounds terribly old-fashioned, but making the tea at the stalls, pouring out the coffee, and not being able to give voice to their own views. And that's where it started. And we thought it would just be, you know, for a few campaigns, but it's gone on and on and on, in the same way that Glasgow Europe webinars have gone on. And there is a thirst for that. And there's a thirst, I think, for women to have a role in civil society and be visible. And where they're not visible, to make noise to become visible.
Okay, so one thing we wanted to ask you about, you've done a lot of work on things like information and that's the whole thing around e-identities and all that kind of thing, and you had a piece recently in Yorkshire Bylines about government proposals on digital identities. Can you explain a bit what's being proposed there by the government, and also maybe link that into the issue of privacy and data protection and so on following Brexit? You know, are there things that you think are at risk now, and how worried should we be about this kind of thing?
I think the pressure for digital identities is worldwide. In Europe, the idea is really that one has one identity token that one can use interchangeably across the EU countries for accessing civil administration like marriages, birth certificate registration, renewing driving licenses and all those sorts of things, but also to be able to use it for banking and getting passports and verifying one's identity. Mm-hmm. In the big issue both in Europe and here, we've had the question of privacy. Who can access that information, and is it private? Are we as individuals in control of it? Mm-hmm. But I think what we find here is not just that we haven't had identity cards and their modern incarnation, except if you have a driving license or if you have a plastic ID card of some description. But the issue here really is what kind of information will be linked. So, for example, if we had a COVID passport, do we just have a passport which says Fiona was vaccinated and had the 2 vaccinations on such and such a date, or just a card which you show this person has had this vaccination on such and such a date, and that's verified against some database, but it doesn't link all the rest of your personal information, so that someone can see, yes, you are who you claim to be, and yes, you've been vaccinated. But they cannot then link it to your health record and see your health record, nor can they link it to, say, if you have private dental care, if you have health insurance of any description, nor can they link it to your social welfare pension payments, or if you've had been on benefits, or if any of your children have been in care, or any kind of social welfare that you might have accessed. Nor can you or should you be able to link it to your credit score, or to your education, or to your employment history. Now, the thing is that all this information is incredibly valuable to companies who want to access it, who want to sell it, whether it's selling us services or whether they are taking chunks of our personal data and selling it on to other people. So, for example, the obvious case in a COVID passport might be, well, someone might have the data and either want to sell some health insurance, or depending on your health status, which they will have checked, of course, or they might want to sell you drugs that you may or may not need.
Right.
So it's a tension between having something which is very narrow and specific and proportionate, i.e. you have this card, you have had those vaccinations, or you have this card and, oh, wow, now I can look at everything else about you without your consent and without your knowledge, and probably without knowing that a lot of the information will be accessed by, in effect, a robot, automated. Okay. And there will be all kinds of biases built into that.
Okay. And I mean, is that something
yes.
that's changing now because of Brexit? I mean, are we more exposed? I think following Brexit.
I think there is a greater danger. I mean, at the moment we have an equivalence agreement with the EU, whereby the EU basically accepts that our data protection legislation is broadly in line with what it was before we left, and therefore they will accept the exchange of information and personal data on that basis. But the moment we deviate, then there's going to be big problems. I mean, there's problems for us as individuals and problems for anybody who is accessing or using anything that relates to transactions with EU citizens, whether it's trade or leisure or whatever. The compliance with the EU legislation has to be there.
Okay, Jenny, did you have something that you wanted to chip in on that on that subject?
Yeah, because previously we had the policy manager from the Open Rights Group on, and she said that there's a large risk of the UK being used for data laundering. Do you think that there's a risk of that in the future?
Yes, definitely. Because it's commerce, isn't it? So anything that can be sold and anything that's digitized can be hacked. So black market and legitimate market. But my biggest concern is that if we are to protect our vulnerable people in society who have far fewer opportunities to protect their data and perhaps do not know when they may or may not consent and how you get redress and how you go about getting incorrect data changed and so on, they need to be protected and we have to protect them. And I do fear that there could be a dilution of legislative compliance or the kind of legislation that we have to protect ourselves. At the same time, there's going to be more technical standards which will be done by industry, and anybody is going to get away with what they can, maximize the amount of profit in the business case. So yes, I think there is a risk, and we need to be vigilant in terms of privacy and in terms of ethical impacts for society.
Okay, I mean, it's quite difficult to know how to do that. I mean, there's a consultation about this at the moment, which I think closes in a couple of days, if I'm right, on the government's proposals for using digital identities. But it doesn't seem to be something that has had a very high profile.
Yes, it's all very well to have a consultation, but it doesn't help if you're not prepared to be strict and open about what you're trying to do. And I think the big problem is that there are perfectly good privacy guidelines and privacy impact assessments which exist and which industry, government and citizens can access, whether one looks at what's available at the EU level through the EU Ombudsman, data protection people, or here, our own in Scotland and in England and Wales, Northern Ireland, or whether one looks at the kinds of things that are produced by institutes like the Biometrics Institute, which has its own biometrics and privacy impact assessment tools, which are guidelines to help industry make sure that they don't just do a checkbox exercise and saying, oh yes, we're compliant with privacy, good practice. And the same applies to the ethical use. And the biggest thread is the linkage between different discrete parts of data. So when I give my information for a driving license, I don't want it exchanged or linked to say something about my preference in terms of buying jeans.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want it linked to anything to do with my health. I don't want it linked to where I may have lived in England over the past 5 years, 15 years or whatever, or which school I went to. That's not relevant to a transaction that I might be doing when I'm saying I need to renew my driving license or I've lost it. So the issue is, if it's discrete and it's purpose limited, we should be told it is purpose limited, and we should not face a situation whereby our children are being asked for their biometrics in school to pay for school lunches or library books. And we don't know what's going to happen to that data now or in the future. And the children themselves are not in a position really to give informed consent about that biometric or various biometrics being taken and used. Particularly worrying is a trend where some people are very keen to predict how a person might behave in future from a biometric profile that's taken from them as a young person.
That's that's really worrying. Actually, that's really worrying. Okay, before we move on, I think Jenny, you've got some questions from social media that have come through.
Yeah, so we have a question here, and someone is asking, do you think that the use of digital identities will affect EU citizens specifically?
I think the EU citizens who are here at the moment, that's been the easy target, hasn't it? And you could say, and I know that some organisations like Big Brother are worried that this is the start of a surveillance society and the introduction of identity cards, which were dropped in 2011. An identity card by itself is not a problem. It's not, it really isn't the identity token that is the problem. The problem is the information to which it is linked and who has access to it or who owns it, and whether we as individuals retain ownership of our personal information. So there's lots of benefits from having an electronic identity that you can use all over the place to verify who you are and to do online transactions. But it is this linkage and ownership and the questions of who's accountable to whom, when, how, and how robust is the security underlying the whole system. So the ecosystem of identity management is incredibly important. Okay,
well, maybe just sort of broaden things out a bit beyond issues of digital information. I mean, obviously, you've got a huge body of work on European institutions and single market and so on. And in terms of the relation, the future relationship between the UK and the EU, where do you see things going in the very short term, and resolving some of the immediate problems that have emerged since Brexit? I mean, especially on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Obviously the UK has taken a unilateral decision to extend the time period for enforcing things. But I mean, how do you see things being resolved, and just in the immediate term?
In the immediate future, I think things are incredibly difficult and unnecessarily and deliberately done by Britain to create an atmosphere of bad faith. That's my impression. And I fear this is not only very detrimental to Northern Ireland and very dangerous for Northern Ireland, where the Good Friday Agreement was created in the expectation that peace and the UK would be in the EU forever. But it's also very dangerous for Britain in the short term, risky rather than dangerous, because it perpetuates an idea that we're really not being very honest and transparent, and we're not very reliable as partners. In the short term, we have the various committees to set up under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and I don't think we've made very much progress on that. Now, that to me is an indication of bad faith, or the row over, should the representative of the Commission in the UK be called an ambassador or not, bad faith. It's all, there's a deliberate skewing, which I think makes it very difficult to maintain our image as otherwise being a trustworthy partner. So in the short term, I think one's got to have a change in the way in which we're presented. And I don't think our negotiators are necessarily doing what they are required to do under the terms of the treaty, or even treating our EU partners as with the respect that they deserve. So it does make me very angry.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem deliberately antagonistic, doesn't it? At the moment, I mean, what do you think the motive is? I mean, we've already seen, the European Parliament deciding to delay ratification. I mean, the initial delay was, I think, to do with translation issues, but now they're suspending the process because of the UK's action. I mean, what are the consequences of that? I mean, does the Trade and Cooperation Agreement fall away? Do we go, is there a risk that we could end up in a no deal situation, or what?
I think it's very, very difficult to predict, because the British are behaving in a very unpredictable manner. And I think the European Parliament is within its rights, and thankfully it wants to scrutinise that agreement systematically, honestly, openly, and with a great deal of expertise. And I think we should welcome that, because our Parliament hasn't scrutinised it, hasn't had the opportunity to. And if the European Parliament is doing as it is required to do, wonderful. And if the European Parliament wants to see these committees set up and the Joint Parliamentary Assembly set up, absolutely brilliant. But whether and how this is going to pan out, I think, is something that we're all having to watch and just hope that behind the scenes sense prevails. And there are channels kept open to allow informal contact, as well as the formal mudslinging that comes from the British side.
Yeah. I mean, it seems that some of that's being done for a domestic audience rather than for an international, for international consumption. I mean, assuming that we can find a sensible path through in the short term. Quite a few people said when the cooperation agreement was reached that it could be seen as a basis for future cooperation. It would be something that could be built on. Do you see it in that way, at least under the present government, or any future government? And I wonder, thinking longer term, say 5, 10, 20 years, how do you see EU-UK relations developing?
I think the basis is there, but there's an institutional framework which could be used incredibly flexibly, could be used very imaginatively to make sure that civil society assembly, for example, and organisations do have their role, as is anticipated in the agreement. But that requires government here to facilitate it. So there are institutional routes, informal routes like Terenka's friendship group, which...
Okay, it looks like Juliet's having trouble getting back in to join us, so I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there for tonight, and hopefully invite Juliet back when we have a better connection. So, yep, that's it for tonight, folks. And thank you very much for watching.